One of the most important things I learned in this class is that language is often used by the government as a ways of shaping not only national identity, but also the sense of how we view ourselves and our other identities, such as maybe as women, as middle class people. And one example is that was when we were discussing women's language in Japan, and how, despite the idea that many people try to connect women's language to traditional Japanese values, all the way back in ancient times, it is actually a very modern um, concept that came after modernization, in terms of after Japan was trying to modernizing to be like the United States and other European Western powers. And I feel like that example really showed me in terms of how we use this sense of constructed myths, and we use language that helps support these constructed myths. And also, another thing I found very interesting was discussing um, the importance of Christian missionaries in standardizing and solidifying the Korean script. Because usually, when I hear people discuss the Korean script, they discuss it as a jewel of the Korean Peninsula. Like it's one of the biggest cultural achievements ever created, but people tend not to discuss how people from outside of the culture also contribute to it as well. And also, I feel that's one another thing that's very important when we talk about nationalism and language, is realizing that all these different fractions about what we learn is also very important to consider. What do we not learn? Who do people not include in the history? Also, another thing I feel like is very important that we learned in this class was how language plays a part in constructing the national self in East Asia. In particular, I feel like one example of that was talking about the debate of whether or not to use Chinese characters in the script in Japan and in Korea. And I feel like one interesting thing is, like, as we were discussing, is it's talking about how it ended into two different separate outcomes. You see the continued use of Chinese characters in Japan, while in South Korea and even in North Korea, the use of Chinese characters has been either almost completely ended, or is slowly becoming less and less relevant and less used. And I think one interesting thing about that example of talking about Chinese characters is talking about how, as nations build and as they advance and also as they evolve, there's a sense of trying to build a sense of self and a sense of separating yourself from other nations. Because so this idea about, wow, back in ancient times, Japan and even the Korean Peninsula might have been vassal states. As modern nations, they can no longer be that. And there's this idea that continuing to use Chinese characters might be an example of being a vassal state, if not politically, then culturally. And I feel one way to also, we were discussing about, to legitimize your sense of nationhood is by having the sense of a cultural pride and sense of cultural achievement. So it's really interesting seeing how language connects to all these different aspects in ways that we don't even know, and it makes you more aware of seeing how language affects your own life.